Today in this video, I want to talk about reading and the shift away from the collective experience of art, because I'm going to argue that there is a connection between how we now experience art as more individualistic interpretation, as opposed to how we would have experienced art in antiquity, which would have been as a collective experience. And I'm going to invite people to think about the idea: does this have a relation to how orthodox people might experience beauty and art, and what are pathways to collective experience of art, and why collective experience of art is actually a positive thing, even though culturally I think we've been led to believe that art is really about how you feel about it, as opposed to how you feel as a group about the art. So what is art, and can anything be called art, is a good question to start off with. So Benedetto Croce was an Italian philosopher in the 19th century who dealt with this very, very topic, and is actually probably responsible for how we all view art at the moment. So Croce was a well-known philosopher, and he changed how the West looked at art. I first heard about Croce on Shoulder Surf's podcast, that's Jeff's podcast. He looks at C.S. Lewis's writings, and in his diary, C.S. Lewis had read a book called The Essence of Aesthetic, which is about figuring out what art is and what it means to people. He believed that at its root, art was not about making things, but about expressing feelings and ideas in a way that connects with others. Specifically, the art changes how you think, and then you can transform other people using that tool. The artist has an intuition, a calling inside them, which they feel must be answered. Now, what it does is that at its root, art is not about making beautiful things, but about expressing feelings and ideas in a way that connects with others. Specifically, it changes how you think and see the world. It becomes a transformational tool. So the process is the artist has an intuition, a calling inside them, which they feel must be answered. And they can't describe how they feel. It's beyond words. What they're called to do is to use more senses. It requires that you use your imagination and connect it with your emotion to be able to understand what that internal feeling is inside you. And then you put that all together, transform your imaginal space. And this gets captured in the piece of art. And when other people look at that, they can see what your imaginal space now looks like. They get an insight into what your imaginal space looks like. In this sense, art for Croce is universal. The taking of a photo or the whittling of wood into a small carving are art, because they transmit the views, the state of mind, the emotions of the artist across to the person viewing that art. So Croce sees art in the same way then that John Vervaeke, our neuroscientist of the corner, sees the transjective as working. The transjective being that thing which transforms the self through a moment of insight, a moment of contact with the transcendent, which throws you beyond your normal subject-object way of looking at the world. And there is one regard of difference between Croce and Vervaeke, and it seems to me to be the scale of impact. For Vervaeke, for John Vervaeke, you won't be the same after the transjective moment has occurred. But for Croce, it seems to him that it's more like there's a range, and that you'll be slightly more different, open to more intuitions. And it could be that how Croce sees art is like a preparatory work for John Vervaeke, right? And leads up to that moment of big impact, which is the transjective moment for John. The introduction of the idea that art was a medium for transmitting emotion and intuition was a radical shift from everything that had gone before. Since ancient times, now thinking of the Greeks here, art had been about the reflection of beauty and perfection. The notion of perfection, of proportion, as developed by the Greeks gave the world some of the most beautiful statues of all time. So it's not a bad idea. However, it seemed to be richer in form than some of modern arts of expression. But by the time the Renaissance came, it seems to have been reaching its heyday. The Renaissance restored the ancient importance of harmony and proportion. But in the background, there was a shift. Just as Europe was being transformed by a weakening of the collective in favor of the individual, so too views on art were being modified. For example, for the ancient Greeks, tragedy had initially been a way of collective group achieving catharsis. But by the time the Romantics come along, the shift of interpreting art is to about the individual emotion, the imagination, and the understanding of the artist's personal experience. This was a shift away from art as objectively beautiful towards art as being meaningful because of its transformational effects on the subject or its role as a window into the soul of the artist. Now, why did this happen, and what was this weakening of European collective identity potentially rooted in? And where did this new mindset come from, and what was lost in the process? Okay, let's go back to the ancients. For the Greeks and Romans, art and religion were deeply intertwined. If you want to get a feel for how our modern times differ, then think about how we have a habit of saying we have events and places we specifically call cultural. We've become blind to the fact that culture is always the water we swim in. But a Greek or Roman would never have understood our idea of culture as something which was remote to us and which we could visit for a night out. I'm going out for a night of culture. I'm going to the theatre. It's a cultural festival. Similarly, art was a way of interfacing with the divine, whether as a channel for the divine or as homage to some deity. The Greek and Romans were certainly capable of feeling awe and reverence in the face of beautiful art, but the dialogue was in the context of the collective and higher, speaking to the individual as part of the collective. Art was a group activity which interacted with the individual, but the individual as part of a group. The spirit which moved the individual was a divine or higher spirit which had a strongly transjective force. You were consciously being confronted with the higher form, with a metaphysical truth. Sure, it has social and political dimensions as well, but that's unavoidable, right, given it's an intertwining between the political, the religious, the social. But how is that avoidable in a sense where it's a collective active society where everybody is pulling together everything into a singular meeting with the divine, including the pulling together of state forces? It feels very empty to me to simply limit this type of experience and to imagine what that would have been like to ask, but how did the individual feel about it? The medieval period saw the same approach in Northern Europe. Beautiful manuscripts and Gothic cathedrals were designed to illuminate the person seeing them. Through their beauty, they became vehicles for a spirit. They were transjective for whole groups of people over time. The idea that the Book of Kells, which is this beautifully illustrated manuscript from the 9th century in Ireland, was about revealing the state of mind of a monk as an individual would have been preposterous to those monks. But consider that we don't even know who those monks are, and we will never know. And even but probably 10 years after the Book of Kells had been done, maybe nobody knew who those monks were. Maybe not. Because the core issue was knowing which monk had done the work or which set of monks was not important. Ultimately, what was important was the creation of this beautiful piece of art which was capturing something of a higher truth. You see, the manuscripts revealed the state of mind of the monk indeed, as Croce might have imagined, but not as an individual, but as a congregant in a wider body. It was always from the perspective of being part of a wider body. Pick the term body because I want to avoid that instinctual reflex in the modern Westerner to balk at the term group. So deeply is our sense of individual identity and the need to be seen and valued on our individual terms. But centuries and millennia after these group contexted artworks were created, we still look at them and value them as beautiful. So clearly, the group context, the group focus is not a hindrance to creating timeless and beautiful art which captures something deeply true. If I look at the famous piece of art by Marcel Duchamp, toilette, he was a French man or a Belgian man, will that still be regarded as impactful art in 2 centuries? And if you want to look up that further, take a look for Marcel Duchamp toilet, and you can see a porcelain toilet, and that's his piece of art. But will anybody be convinced if I were to tell you that yes, in 2 centuries, that is art, and will be regarded as so, because Marcel Duchamp called it art, and that's good enough for me. So what caused this shift from the ability to collectively experience art to the insistence that it be deeply subjective? My fields are good enough for me. One possible reason for me is that it could be related to a critical shift in the tool of communication available to us. When the ancients experienced plays and literature, it was overwhelmingly as an oral experience. The Iliad and Odyssey were listened to for centuries in a group dynamic centered around traveling bards. Similarly, Roman poetry and Greek drama were group and even city-scale events. Right up to the late Middle Ages, the spoken word had primacy. Understanding was rooted in a shared event. This ranged from the ancient stories of the Irish Shanachie to the travelling mystery plays of England. But something big was coming down the line, which would radically shift society towards individualism. The printing press was invented about 1450, you see, and from then the printing press spread with a mind-blowing rapidity. Within 50 years, 20 million books would be printed. And as literacy began to spread, something began to change. And this relates to how oral societies work vis-a-vis literary-based societies. In an oral society, information is closely related to memory and performance. The spoken word is tied to the presence of the speaker, fostering a communal bond and dynamic interaction. But reading a book yields a different experience. It reduces the communal aspect, and the sense of immediacy changes. The experience is no longer situational. You are no longer participating in a shared experience outside of you. Now you are able to sink into your own thoughts, deeply analyze and reflect on what you have just read. And much of that is positive, obviously, but we should unthinkingly believe nothing was lost. And maybe some important things were lost. Think about John Vervaeke's 4 Ps, and bonus points to whoever can remember all 4 Ps off the top of their head. How you participate, the procedures you use to participate, your perspective, and your propositions. All of those things will undergo a radical shift because of your reading. Now, a person who talked an awful lot about this is Marshall McLuhan. He wrote a book called The Gutenberg Galaxy, and he warned that the printing press transformed human consciousness and society. Printing would drive the shift towards linear, analytical thinking. Rather than having a communal narrative, people would shift towards an individual viewpoint. How you related to the information would even change. It would be visual. It would no longer be a mix of several senses. But wider even than that, printing would homogenize culture, establishing ever wider pools of uniformity and rolling out a single perspective in a way that the shared communal experience never did. Simply because of scale. A shared communal experience will be limited, maybe maximally to a Dunbar number, right? How many people can you speak to and project your voice? In a Greek theatre, probably close to a few thousand. But beyond that, so there's a limitation on what the oral can achieve. The Gutenberg press standardized and prioritized propositional knowledge, creating what McLuhan called a typographic mind, a way of thinking focused on logic, structure, and analysis, focusing on the individual experience at the expense of knowing as a part of a wider body. So the basis of knowing changed from collective, grounded in the collective experience, to sitting in your room as an individual, lights on, focused on your book. And that's your full depth of knowing. Even stronger, McLuhan said, print raises the visual features of alphabet to highest intensity of definition. Thus, print carries the individuating power of the phonetic alphabet much further than manuscript culture could ever do so. Print is the technology of individualism. If men decide to modify this visual technology by an electrical technology, individualism would also be modified. And of course, this is what has happened. We have modified print through the use of the internet and through how I'm engaging with you now with text on a Word document that guides me and helps me to focus my thoughts in a way, modifying how I express myself. And you see, this last part should hit home, because modifying the visual technology of writing using electronic technology will modify the individual. It has modified me. The very act of scripting a video on YouTube of my thoughts on this subject is to engage in the process of reversing individualism, right? I'm taking the technology that has been given to me, which has modified my individualism, maybe created a sense of false individualism or delimited a type of individualism, and certainly removed me from participation with the collective, amplified my isolation that we all experience through reading and through individualized gaining of knowledge. And interestingly enough, YouTube is allowing a flip on that, right? As it was described, we are using the power of the dark arts to modify the dark arts. I think it was Sam who used these particular words, but other people like Kale have also talked like that. So the very act of scripting a video on YouTube on this subject is to engage in the process of reversing individualism using electronic technology. Sure, it's not immediate as a storyteller, but to watch the audio-visual blend of YouTube in the context of a shared space like the little corner is to engage in a partial shift back in time, back before the advent of typographic man, the type of person delimited by the written word as described by Marshall McLuhan. But there is a further dimension to this, and it is Socrates who lands the blow. In Plato's Phaedrus, Socrates, the great conversationalist, tells a story about writing in ancient Egypt. The king warns that writing will harm memory and will give the appearance of wisdom. You see, the words are external to you. You will be able to read them, but you won't know how to use them. You won't have internalized that particular knowledge. Socrates proposes an alternative. Living words written in the mind, explored through dialogue. Phaedrus sums it up beautifully. You mean the living and breathing word of him who knows, of which the written word may justly be called the image? And that is a beautiful line. I really like that. The notion that the image doesn't, a signifier, a word is a signifier, right? And elevating the importance of that which is signified way beyond the word. What is the living and breathing word of him who knows? And, for our little corner, perhaps that's a very meaningful pointer, a foreshadowing. It is a beautiful line, and for me, it sums up the phenomenon of this little corner of colonizing each other's minds, as Paul van der Klee says, where engaging in conversation and establishing relationality to each other is a fundamental part of reversing the meaning crisis of individualism and trying to restore what has been lost in the shift away from the communities in which we should be embedded. So what does this mean? What is the practical aspect of this? I once saw Uberboy describe this as, put down books. And I suspect that it probably links to what he had talked about at that time. There is an element of, in the video, Luke from the Grail Country had talked about, don't quote people, instead integrate their ideas and put them into your own words. What Jordan Peterson says, I didn't want to use the words of others. I wanted to use my own words. And I think this is very connected to it. And as I sit here now and make this video, I hear the sound of the computer. The sun is shining. It's a beautiful day here. And I see the light changing on the microphone. I feel myself sitting on the couch. I'm actually engaged in a type of collective process with those people who might see this. And even if nobody sees it, I'm still engaged in a collective. I'm engaged in a reaching out beyond the limitations imposed on me by reading. And that's really beautiful. And I think this is a preparatory phase for live stream, right? For this type of dialogue we have where we take ideas and we take plot lines and we take experiences and we begin to chew them over in order to be able to shift our perspective, to engage in participation, to be able to reassess what our propositions are knowing, our propositional knowing is. And I think that's a very beautiful thing. So if I could encourage you to do one thing, it would be try to explore the written word at least half the time, and try to explore the spoken word the other half of the time, and share those spoken words, because who knows, you might be able to go back to being a medieval man, which would be a pretty cool thing to do. Thank you for anybody who has stayed with me till now.